The Lennoxers are believed to be descendants of the ancient warrior people known as the Dragonids. Very little information concerning them survives to the present day. Only the very basics of their culture and history can be described without any speculations. The Dragonids were natives of Eulalia, the island in northwestern Rathnir, where the modern nation of Lennox would one day be established. They held fire and light in very high regard, to the point that every single one of their weapons had enchantment fire aspect or flame, making them very skilled in the magic for their time. At some point, an unknown enemy made their numbers dwindle in such a way that their very existence was threatened. The remaining Dragonids would gather in a city named Konopios, and in a last act of defiance unleashed a devastating flame spell. The destruction caused by the spell was so devastating, most of the island would be turned into a desert, and the remains of the city would be blackened by the fire. It is said that in its ruins lay a terrible secret. Despite the supposed self-destruction of their civilization, a small number of Dragonids survived. Though it is unclear what happened to them afterwards, it's only after many centuries that one of their descendants would reappear in recent history, when Buzzian founded a city in the south of the island and named it after his ancestors, and thus planting the seeds of what would become Lennox. 400 years after the defeat of Konopios, Buzzian, a dubious descendant of Chief Mephet and member of the House of Lennox, which was a cadet branch of the main Dragonid royal family, moved from his then home in Andorn to search for a new home in his ancestors' homeland. Shortly after the island of Eulalia was ravaged by the desert and blackened by fire, according to myth, some of the noble families sought shelter elsewhere. Other than the House of Lennox, it is unclear what eventually happened to any of these families. The House of Lennox, being the cadet branch, was fairly undocumented, but what is known is that they were a family of architects, according to Buzzian, and it can be assumed that they designed the then beautiful city of Konopios. Buzzian also trained to become an architect and an engineer, and upon reaching the shores of western Eulalia, he sought to find sheltered bay with sufficient greenery to sustain a small town. His ancestors before him had failed to find any significant green lands near Konopios, hence their exodus from the land. Suiting his needs, the city of Dragonia was founded upon its current location in the remembrance and honor of the Dragonid society. Shortly afterwards, he founded the Kingdom of Lennox so that he could revive his ancestors' culture. This is the mission of the Pharaoh Buzzian. Many of the ideals he put in place in honor of his ancestors' culture endure today, such as a constitutional monarchy, architectural style, the flag of Lennox, and the right to vote. The coalition war and the fall of Bardonian Empire would hugely benefit Lennox. Not only would the population rise again, but Riverrun would join the nation. Without Bardonia, the northern half of the island would be left uninhabited, allowing for a massive colonialization of the land, doubling the size of the country. Numerous ancient cities like June or the Sand Republic would be rediscovered, along with ancient structures and ruins. The old TSR ice road would play a capital role in this endeavor, linking the two halves of the island together, and would be used as a basis for a northern highway system. The history of Lennox is mostly comprised of its struggles to find a land to settle on, as well as its great extensive building projects. Initially a squatter settlement on the TSR land, the squatter nation, then known simply as Dragonia, was founded upon the foundations of the current capital city of the same name. Through encounters with many new players passing by Lennox, it began to build up a small community. In late March 2021, the land was ceded to the Sterling Crownlands. Following this, Lennox then resettled to what is now known as the Buzzilux, where it set up its second city, Fort Dragoon. For a while, the people of Lennox prospered on the isle, finishing the ambitious construction project set out by the Pharaoh Buzzian. Amongst these projects was a lighthouse, which later became a staple of Lennoxer architecture. On April 7th, the Sterling Crownlands suddenly dissolved, and the city of Dragonius was incorporated into Lennox, which marked the beginning of a golden era for Lennox. During the so-called Golden Era, the population of Lennox grew rapidly, and as a result, the city of Dragonios grew rapidly, with the notable construction projects such as a lighthouse and the pyramid being completed. The Golden Era soon came to an end after many misunderstandings involving the territory known as the Buzzilux. Costarian, the nation situated to the north of the Buzzilux, had claimed the island beforehand. However, when the leader of Lennox asked to claim the island a few weeks later, the previous owner of the island, which was Carve, gave the island to Lennox. Due to this, the ownership of the island had been disputed. The people of Lennox built a city on the island, whereas Costarian abandoned the island, but still claimed the island before Lennox. A compromise was put in place where neither nation was to receive the island. Instead, the island would be ceded to Ryzan and be under the effective control of the then governor, Buzzian. Soon after, a small unlanded nation known as the Britannics wanted to gain some land in the area of the TSR in order to found their own nation. The former pharaoh Buzzian agreed to a union of Lennox and the Britannics, leading to the renaming of Lennox as the Empire of Lennox. Another small nation known as the Empire of White Raven contacted the pharaoh Buzzian to show their interest in acquiring the land in the area so that they may expand their small island nation. The three nations formed an alliance in which they planned to take uninhabited TSR lands, with the pharaoh Buzzian taking measures to make sure that no religious or cultural sites belonging to the TSR were to be taken. However, these demands were ignored by the Empire of White Raven, who plotted to attack the capital and grief the roads in the area without negotiating land claims with the TSR. This came under major scrutiny of the pharaoh Buzzian, who planned an alternative route of action for Lennox. On the 17th of April, a Castarian spy leaked documentation published by the leader of the Empire of White Raven, which outlined his nation's plan of attack for conquest. This was leaked along with messages from the members of all three alliance members. The manner in which these messages were leaked put significant emphasis on Lennox's role in the plans of the Empire of White Raven, despite never specifically agreeing to go along with these plans. As a result, the now fallen Empire Bardonia declared war on Lennox and the Empire of White. Soon after, Pharaoh Buzzian stepped down as a leader of Lennox, announcing Sirius to be his successor and Sans Liga to continue his role as the Grand Vizier. Prior to his abdication as pharaoh, Buzzian commissioned his last building project, a series of defensive towers around the island which were designated to protect the people of Lennox from incoming Bardonian invaders. At the same time, 80% of the population of Lennox was forced out due to fears of more spies being within the country. Meanwhile, the Britannics were forced to disband, which ended the union. Following Bardonia's declaration of war, Buzzian not only stepped down as a pharaoh, but also disbanded Lennox as a whole. Upon learning this, a recently new citizen named Sirius would try to bring Lennox together and recreate the nation. Not only would this work, but the following day, Buzzian himself would bring shulker boxes to Sirius' pyramid, containing presents such as heads and enchantment books. Most importantly, there was a book presented in which the now former pharaoh would crown Sirius as the pharaoh of Lennox. At the time, Sirius only had been in Lennox for a handful of days, and not much longer in Rathnir itself. His first true act as pharaoh was to engage in diplomacy with the various parties involved in the war, convincing Bardonia to not invade. However, he had been told of Bardonia's expansionist nature, so he started to prepare. Thinking that a future invasion would happen on the southern coast, he built multiple forts and connected them all with a secret underground ice road network. The remaining ice would be used in Sirius' second grand project, the Ice Highway. This would link Dragunios, the Valian Empire, and the city of Ramtopia, an abandoned settlement northeast of Lennox, which was integrated and expanded. In the span of a few weeks, the population of the country skyrocketed, going from 4 to 30, from a population of 12 to 15 before the expulsion of untrusted peoples from Lennox following various leaks in the Buzzian era. Among those newcomers was Rambo, who became Ramtopia's governor, and Spiral, both of who ended up as Grand Viziers. This period would also see the border expand, not only to the west to include Ramtopia, but also eastward, making Lennox in control of most of Eularia's southern coast. After Oendir's downfall, a small colony was created on a small peninsula on the northeast of Silftord called Madeira. However, this colony would not last long, as it was revealed that this land had belonged to Halge, a small country on Rathnir's northern border. This gave rise to a lot of tension to that point that Sirius even considered invading and annexing them. However, the threat of Bardonia joining the war made him change his mind and give the land back. Outside of Lennox's border, Bardonia was expanding again. One after another, the kingdom's allies fell, regardless of the help that was sent to them. Each of their allies were eventually integrated into the ever-growing Bardonian Empire. Even the Sand Republic was eventually dissolved and all of its land was given to Bardonia, which would leave Lennox surrounded on all sides. Before declaring open threats, Bardonia would engage in more underhanded diplomacy. A book would be found which would read, "You are doomed. We have spies on the inside." The book was signed by an individual named Hernisi, a member of the Bardonian government. Following this, signs ordering the Lennoxers to leave their land under the threat of unarmed consequences would be found. While raising suspicions for spies, the inhabitants did not leave. Soon after, a chunk of the bridge would be destroyed near Dragunios, and one last threat was found, accompanied with a banner depicting a yellow flower. During this time, a number of construction projects were made by the then Prime Minister Buzzian, who returned after a while. These included the planning of the bazaar, harbor, and expansions onto the east side of the island. All of these projects are now nearing full completion. Around this time, a large percentage of the nation went inactive after an influx of new players into the server, further harming Lennox's already dwindling power to defeat Bardonia. On the 10th of June, an ultimatum was officially declared by Bardonia to Lennox, offering a simple choice: join or war. During the negotiations, the Empire's motives would be revealed. Since the Sand Republic gave all of its land to Bardonia, but since it also gave land to Lennox before that, it meant that Lennox also belonged to Bardonia. Sirius would finally choose to surrender, seeing how little hope they had at winning a full war against the Empire, especially without Ryzen's support. Immediately after the conquest of Lennox, there was a mass exodus of players from the nation. This meant that many of the more ambitious projects took months to complete, and a cultural genocide took place. Despite the Bardonian government not implementing any policies to harm Lennox, the simple fact that Lennox lost the majority of its population as they fled meant that there were few people to sustain Lennoxer culture. Soon after, Lennox gained some territory from the island south of the mainland. Also, Buzzian entered negotiations to transfer Riverrun to the province of Lennox. However, due to the anger from leaders of Osconia, this never happened, despite Riverrunians requesting for a transfer. On the 26th of July, a world war broke out, with Pharaoh Sirius I declaring independence from Bardonia. Plans were immediately drawn up for battle, with collaboration with other rebelling states such as Ryzan, Valais, Axum, Halgay, and many others. Almost immediately, the free city of the Riverrun announced its independence from Bardonia and joined Lennox. Spiral, the Grand Vizier, declared his neutrality from the conflict due to his honorable belief that Lennoxer independence should be secured through diplomacy and not bloodshed. After coalition and rebel forces converged on New Darasrak, finally defeating the residual Bardonian forces, Lennox fully secured its independence. Lennox then began expanding into more of Yularian Isle, gaining custody of the long-abandoned city of the Sand Republic, which became known as Zarok. In the coming days, as Siltor began to adapt to the status quo, the territory of Riverrun formally joined the Kingdom of Lennox. The Isle of Eularia experienced a fragmentary existence, divided between the nations of Halgay, Lennox, Ostalen, Valais, and Deliria, who owned the stretch of land known as Tarenbach, just outside the Lennox capital city, Dragunios. Recognizing the need for the united Eulara, alongside a united Siltor, Grand Vizier Spiral Ubener began the process of forming the Solar Alliance, which was a defensive pact to slow or halt a possible reoccurrence invasion of the Isle. The addition of Halgay, Valais, Baeconia, and later the United Commonwealth served to add stability to the region. Over time, Lennox began a gradual recovery from the Bardonian occupation by increasing its population and expanding its towns and infrastructure. Riverrun began creating a system of western canals reaching as far as Novia. Dragunios expanded its ice aqueduct system, enabling island-wide access to approximately 95% of Eularian settlements. It was at around this point that Lennoxer towns of Thiriti, June, Nirmo, and Marlhold were created. Dragunios in particular had a unique resurgence, constructing the Temple of Lux, beginning work on the Grand Bazaar shopping district, as well as building a fully continuous aqueduct across the entire city. The eastern coastline of the city particularly saw an expansion, receiving more citizens who developed housing and coastal pathways. A sale of Tarenbach by the Delirians to the Delirian nobility without consultation of Lennox officials served to create a briefly uneasy period during the Dragunios resurgence due to the territory sitting immediately outside the eastern Dragunios walls. The new territory renamed itself to the Kingdom of Credia, creating their capital of Thelsia. While relations were briefly tenuous, Lennox and the fledgling nation soon established an amicable respect for each other. The Kingdom of Lennox joined the Siltor League in order to further secure their independence from foreign interference, working closely with Siltor states to ensure regional stability. Later, internal tensions within the League resulted in its dissolution and caused Lennox to become more isolationist. This was to avoid war with larger continental powers. By contrast, Credia soon joined the Fourth Empire Bardonia as a member province, resulting in an increase in suspicion between the Kingdom of Lennox and its immediate neighbor. Prior to the entry of Credia into the Fourth Empire Bardonia, Valais was experiencing an issue with hostile squatters occupying its northern coastline, close to the city of Alturk. Their settlements of Kevin and Phoenicia allowed for multiple avenues for general misdeeds upon the Isle, with the declaration of war placed upon the Credian capital, but soon was retracted. However, soon afterwards, the Lennox military was alarmed to discover a declaration of war upon the historic town of Ramtopia due to terrorism. contact with the leadership of Kevin and Phoenicia did not result in elaboration as to the evidence pertaining to any acts of terrorism committed by the Ramtopian citizen. Lennox set about rallying allies such as the Legion of Lux, the Cretian military, the Valian army, the Helgane army, a handful of volunteers from Tortuga, and volunteer forces from the organization known as the Siltor Rangers. In response, the squatters attempted intimidation tactics by implying their population of 9 individuals was far larger, to little effect. Resultant ultimatums by their leadership for surrender of Ramtopia and capitulation by their citizenry went unheeded. Lennox Kopeshi warriors set about mustering supplies from river-run armories, and the looming war became inevitable. The swiftness of the war declaration left little time for preparation of defenses within the traditionally agricultural town of Ramtopia. However, superior numbers proved overpowering the attacking forces, resulting in the Kevin Phoenician force retreating to their own claim, wherein they were repeatedly dispatched. Despite this, use of traps by the squatters led to some casualties among the Lennox force, although not nearly enough to win the day. Lennox's victory led to squatters' attempts of claiming violations of war rules to save face, but to little effect. Discovery of illegal AFK fish farms and recordings of alleged attempts of duping discussed in the voice chats resulted in Kevi squatter forces quickly being banned. A memorial of the battle was erected in Ramtopia with the names of all who attended inscribed on its base. With the end of the Battle of Ramtopia, Lennox looked increasingly toward consolidating regional security in Eularia, in a trend following the similar concerns of Vale and Halge. These attempts led to creation of Eularian Union, which was later renamed to the Three Thrones, the Lennox, Halge, and Vale. As member states, the Kingdom of Lennox remained fully in control of its territories during this time. Hello everyone, I hope that you enjoyed this video. I actually had to cut a lot out of this video. There is so much history and lore to this nation, so please be sure that you check out the wiki page for Lennox. I can't stress enough, it's a really good page, so I hate that I had to cut as much as I did out of it, but it's definitely worth checking out. Other than that, as always, thank you all so much for all the love and support. Again, if you ever want to request a video, or if you want to suggest a video, or if you just want to get in contact with me, my Discord link is down in the description below, so feel free to check that out. Other than that, I hope you all have a great day, and thank you again for watching.